Get this little brat out of my briefing room. Admiral Reeves seized her by the arm and shoved her toward the door so hard she hit the frame. Papers flew. A coffee mug shattered on the floor. Every senior officer in the room laughed. 5,000 soldiers watching the live broadcast went completely silent. The young commander straightened herself, turned around, and looked Reeves dead in the eyes without blinking. Her voice was so calm it was almost frightening. Your western flank will be destroyed in 12 minutes. Nobody laughed after that. Drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story has traveled. Subscribe and stay until the very end. The briefing room at Fort Liberty smelled like burnt coffee and old ambition. It was the kind of room where careers were made and broken before breakfast, where men with more medals than conscience sat in high-backed chairs and pretended they had already thought of everything. 43 senior officers filled that space on the morning of the readiness exercise, shoulder to shoulder, rank upon rank, the collective weight of their experience pressing down on every square inch of air. Maps covered every wall. Digital overlays blinked with troop positions and supply corridors. 5 command screens ran live feeds from different sectors of the training ground. Everything looked organized. Everything looked controlled. And that was exactly the problem. Nobody had noticed the thin woman standing near the back of the room yet. She wasn't trying to be noticed. Commander Ava Mitchell had spent 11 years perfecting the art of going unseen in rooms full of people who were absolutely certain they were the most important person present. She wore a standard-issue combat uniform with no personal decorations beyond her rank insignia, no unit patches that might spark conversation, no commendations pinned to her chest like trophies. She had a notepad, a pen, and a habit of watching the edges of things while everyone else watched the center. She had arrived 40 minutes early. Nobody had acknowledged her. That was fine. She used those 40 minutes to study every map on every wall with the kind of quiet intensity that looked to a casual observer like nothing at all. She moved slowly. She did not point. She did not ask questions of the staff officers arranging the command displays. She simply looked, cataloged, and listened to the ambient conversations happening around her. The half-finished sentences between exhausted lieutenants. The inside jokes between colonels who hadn't slept properly in a week. The low arguments between logistics coordinators who kept disagreeing about convoy timing. By the time Admiral Jonathan Reeves entered the room, Ava had already seen 5 separate problems with the operational plan. She hadn't said anything yet. Reeves walked in the way powerful men walk when they've been powerful for a long time. Unhurried, almost casual. The kind of movement that communicates without words that the room belongs to you and everyone in it is a guest. Officers straightened involuntarily. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Even the ambient hum of the equipment seemed to drop a register as if the machines themselves recognized authority. Reeves was 61 years old, broad across the shoulders, and carried his age, the way a stone wall carries weather. It was there it had happened, and it had made him harder, not weaker. He had commanded operations on 4 continents. He had led men through situations that didn't make the history books because the history books didn't have high enough clearance. His face was the face of a man who had been correct so many times that being wrong had stopped being a meaningful possibility in his mind. I took his position at the head of the room without greeting anyone and immediately began the briefing. Western Assault Corridor opens at 0600. Alpha Team pushes through Sector 7, while Bravo maintains holding positions along the eastern ridge. Drone surveillance will cover the gap between 1400 and 1700 hours. Communication blackout protocols are set supply convoys move on schedule. Questions. There were never questions when Reeves asked for questions that way. The tone didn't invite them. The tone performed the invitation while simultaneously closing the door. Ava raised her hand. The room noticed her for the first time. Some officers actually turned to look as if a ghost had materialized near the rear wall. A few exchanged glances. A lieutenant colonel near the front shifted uncomfortably in his chair, the way people shift when they sense that someone is about to do something that is going to make everyone else uncomfortable. Reeves looked at her. "Who are you?" he said. Not hostile yet, just flat. The question a man asks when he does not expect the answer to be interesting. "Commander Ava Mitchell," she said. "I've been attached to the readiness assessment team for this exercise." There was a pause. Reeves looked at the staff officer to his right. The staff officer gave a small nod. Yes, she was cleared. Yes, she was supposed to be here. Reeves absorbed this with the expression of a man who has just been told the restaurant substituted a different wine and has decided to accept it without enthusiasm. Your question, Commander. It's less a question than an observation, Ava said. The Western Assault Corridor, as currently planned, will encounter a problem in the first 12 minutes. The drone surveillance gap you mentioned doesn't account for the revised terrain configuration from the pre-exercise mapping update last week. The updated data shows a natural depression along the corridor that didn't exist in the original reconnaissance. Alpha Team will move through that depression without realizing the drone has lost line of sight. They'll be blind, and so will you. The room was very quiet, Ava continued. There's also a communication encryption issue that was flagged by Sergeant Ferris's team 2 days ago. The flag was routed to logistics instead of communications command. I don't believe it was reviewed. If the standard protocol runs during the exercise, you're going to hit a 7 to 10 minute window where Alpha Team can't reach command regardless of the drone situation. Now the room wasn't just quiet, it had the specific quality of silence that precedes either a very calm conversation or a very loud one. Reeves looked at her the way he might look at something he'd found on the bottom of his boot. You've been attached to the assessment team, he said slowly. You are not a mission planner. You are not part of this command structure. You are an observer. Yes, sir. Then observe. Sir, the window of... Commander. His voice had changed. The flatness was gone. There was something underneath it now, something that had been waiting with the patient confidence of a man who rarely needed to use it. This plan has been reviewed by 4 senior planning officers and approved through SOCOM. The drone protocols were established by a team with combined experience that I suspect exceeds your entire career. I respect the role of your assessment team. I do not respect interruptions built on a 60-second scan of maps you've never worked with before. I've been in this room for 40 minutes, Ava said. That was the moment the temperature changed. Reeves stared at her. Something moved behind his eyes too fast to read cleanly. Then he said it. Get this little brat out of my briefing room. The laughter started small and then expanded the way laughter does when people are relieved to have been given permission to do something they were already considering. Officers who had been holding neutral expressions let them slip. A few chuckled openly. One colonel near the window actually leaned back in his chair, as if settling in for entertainment. Ava stood where she was. She did not flush. She did not look at the floor. She did not do the thing that most people do in that moment. The reflexive social retreat, the apologetic backward step, the mumbled, sorry for interrupting. She just looked at the map, at the specific section of the Western Corridor where the terrain depressions sat like a quiet secret. Then she looked at Reeves. Your western flank will collapse in 12 minutes, she said. I want you to remember I told you. She turned and walked out of the briefing room. Behind her, a junior officer near the door moved quickly to let her pass. Nobody else moved. The room sat in the specific, uncomfortable stillness of a crowd that has just witnessed something they don't know how to categorize. Reeves cleared his throat. Let's continue, he said. Nobody mentioned her name again. So, what the officers in that briefing room did not know, what almost no one outside of 3 specific classified programs knew, was that Commander Ava Mitchell had been in that kind of room before. Not the same room, not the same base, but the same dynamic, the same architecture of certainty, the same gathering of experienced and decorated men who had collectively decided that the shape of their own expertise was the shape of the world. She had been underestimated so many times and in so many different ways that it had stopped being something that happened to her and become something she had learned to use. Ava had entered the Navy 8 years after her older brother Thomas had washed out of BUD/S with a knee injury in his 4th week. Thomas Mitchell had been the decorated one, the natural one, the one everyone in their family talked about with that particular mixture of pride and grief that attaches to a potential that almost happened. Ava had grown up in his shadow without ever resenting it, because from the time she was 12 years old, she understood that her brother's way of moving through the world was not going to be her way. Thomas wanted to be seen. He needed the validation of the record, the rank, the story that people could tell about him. He was a good man and a decent soldier, and he had been destroyed not by his knee, but by the 10,000 small moments where he had confused recognition with achievement. Ava had never needed to be seen. She needed to be right. She had graduated from Annapolis in the middle of her class deliberately. She understood earlier than most that the top of the class was a place where people watched you, and people watching you was a disadvantage in the kind of work she intended to do. She had put exactly enough visible effort into exactly the right things to establish competence without drawing sustained attention. Her instructors had noted her intelligence. One had written in a performance review that she had never read that Mitchell possessed an unusual capacity for pattern recognition under conditions where other officers default to protocol. Another had simply written that she was quiet in ways that feel strategic rather than passive. Both of them had been right. She had spent her first 4 years after commissioning in conventional assignments that bored her and that she executed with precise, unremarkable competence. She had asked for and received a transfer to a joint intelligence and assessment program that most officers avoided because it offered limited advancement and even more limited recognition. She had spent 3 years in that program learning how the military's information ecosystem actually functions specifically, where it broke, where warnings disappeared, where the gap between what junior personnel knew and what senior personnel believed created the fissures through which disasters traveled. Then had come the classified work. The operational assessments run alongside SEAL teams in environments where her job was not to fight, but to watch how the fighting was organized, where decisions were made, where the chain of communication either held or failed. She had watched good operations collapse because of things that had been known and not heard. She had watched commanders with decades of experience make catastrophic choices because the information environment around them had been shaped by their own authority into something that confirmed what they already believed. She had learned the system's blind spots by living inside them. And when she walked into the Fort Liberty briefing room that morning and stood for 40 minutes studying the maps while everyone ignored her, she was not studying the enemy's position. She was studying the command structure's relationship with its own information. She was looking for the places where the plan had been built on the assumption that the people in that room already had everything they needed. They didn't. They never did. The exercise began at 0600 exactly on schedule. Ava watched from the assessment team's monitoring station, a separate room connected to the main command displays via live feeds, but positioned far enough from the primary command center that the officers in charge could and did forget she existed. She was with two other assessment team members, Major Derek Holt, a quiet Army Ranger with 15 years in logistics analysis, and Dr. Sarah Chen, a civilian systems analyst who had been embedded with military planning teams for the better part of a decade. Neither of them had been in the briefing room. Both of them had been fully briefed by Ava within 60 seconds of her exit. "How long?" Holt said, watching the primary feed. 11 minutes, maybe 12, Ava said. "Depends on how fast they move through the depression. If they're running at full pace, the drone loses them faster." "What about the encryption flag?" "Still not addressed, which means when the terrain problem hits, they're not going to be able to reach command by standard channel. They'll spend 3 to 4 minutes trying the protocol before someone thinks to go to backup." Chen was looking at the Western Quarter feed with her arms folded. And the backup channel. Also flagged. Different issue, different report, same fate. Holt was quiet for a moment. "You told Reeves?" "I did. And he had me removed from his briefing room." The room was quiet. On the main screen, Alpha Team was moving through the beginning of the Western Corridor in sharp, disciplined formation. They looked exactly like what they were. Well-trained, well-equipped soldiers executing a plan that had been approved by 4 senior officers and a 3-star admiral with decades of combat experience. They moved with the particular confidence of people who trust the intelligence they've been given. Ava watched them and felt something she had no proper word for. It wasn't satisfaction. It wasn't dread. It was the thing that happened when you could see two possibilities simultaneously: the world that existed in the commander's mental model and the world that actually existed, and you knew exactly where those two versions were going to collide, and you had already tried to prevent it, and you had been thrown out of the room. 4 minutes, she said quietly. At the main command center, Admiral Reeves watched his own screens with the expression of a man who has done this before and is not worried. His officers maintained position around him. Communication updates came in at regular intervals, clean and formatted, and exactly according to protocol. The operation was running beautifully. 3 minutes in the drone's signal trace showed a slightly unusual angle. A staff officer noted it, logged it, moved on, within the standard variance range. 4 minutes and Alpha Team descended into the depression. The drone lost line of sight contact. It happened not dramatically, but ordinarily, the way most disasters begin with a small reading that looked like another small reading, with a telemetry shift that registered as weather interference, with a brief communication check that came back slightly degraded and was attributed to terrain scatter. At the monitoring station, Holt said nothing. Chen said nothing. Ava said nothing. They watched the screen. At 7 minutes, the encrypted communication channel began showing errors. The errors were logged by the automated system. No alert was generated because the error rate had not yet crossed the protocol threshold. The protocol threshold had been set for a different scenario. At 9 minutes, Alpha Team tried to contact command. Nothing. They tried the backup channel. Nothing. At the main command center, Lieutenant noticed the communication gap and reported it to his superior. The superior checked the protocol. The protocol said to wait for the backup channel confirmation before escalating. He waited. At 11 minutes, the field commander of Alpha Team made the decision that any experienced field commander would make in his position. Facing a communications blackout and unexpected terrain, he defaulted to last known orders and held position. Holding position in the middle of an exposed depression. Without drone coverage, without communication, in a readiness exercise designed to simulate adversarial engagement conditions. The simulation registered the exposure. The exercise system marked the entire Alpha Team as compromised. At 12 minutes, the Western Corridor operation collapsed. Back at the main command center, the silence that fell was the specific silence of people absorbing information that contradicts something they were absolutely certain of 60 seconds ago. The kind of silence that has weight. Officers stared at screens. Someone said what happened in a tone that wasn't quite a question. Reeves stood at the command display with his hands behind his back and looked at the red indicators spreading across the Western sector map with an expression that nobody in that room had ever seen on his face before. He said nothing for a long moment. Then he turned to his chief of staff. "Get me a status report." "Alpha Team is compromised, sir. Comms are down on both primary and secondary channels. The drone lost contact at approximately minute 4. "Why?" "Terrain configuration, sir. Apparently the last mapping update." "Why was I not briefed on the mapping update?" The chief of staff opened his mouth and then closed it again. Around the room, officers were doing their own version of the same calculation, tracing backward through decisions and approvals and reports, looking for the moment where the information had existed and not traveled. A junior logistics officer said very quietly to no one in particular, "The mapping update was distributed 2 days ago. I thought I assumed it had been reviewed for the plan revision." Nobody looked at him directly. Everyone heard him. Reeves turned back to the screens. The red spread further. A secondary unit moved up to support Alpha Team's expected advance, had hit a confusion point, and was now holding the wrong position. At the monitoring station, Ava was already writing notes on her pad. Specific notes, not about what had gone wrong. She already knew what had gone wrong, but about what would need to happen in the next 15 minutes to salvage what remained salvageable. Her notes were organized not by rank or protocol, but by what was actually known by whom and what could be verified in time to matter. Her radio crackled. "Commander Mitchell." It was a voice she didn't recognize. Formal, controlled, carefully neutral. "The Admiral is requesting your presence at the primary command center." She looked at Holt. He said nothing. She looked at the pad in her hand. "Tell him I'll be there in 2 minutes, she said, "and tell him to have Sergeant Ferris and the drone technician on duty for this morning standing by. And anyone else who filed a concern in the last 72 hours that wasn't directly addressed by a senior officer." There was a pause on the radio. "I'll pass that along, Commander." She stood up, straightened her uniform, and looked at Chen. "Come with me," she said. "Bring everything." The walk from the monitoring station to the primary command center took 4 minutes. In those 4 minutes, 3 different things happened at the same time. In the Western Corridor, Alpha Team's field commander was making quick, methodical assessments of his position. He was a good officer. He knew something had gone wrong. He didn't know what. He was working with what he had, which was not very much, and making decisions that were reasonable, given what he'd been told, and unreasonable given what was actually true. He was doing exactly what the system had trained him to do, and the system had failed him. In the main command center, Admiral Reeves was standing at the map and saying nothing while his officers quietly tried to fix things they didn't fully understand. Some of them were competent. Some of them were making the situation worse in small ways they couldn't yet see. All of them were operating from the same mental model that had produced the original plan, which meant they were trying to solve the problem using the same assumptions that had created it. And in a communications annex adjacent to the main building, a young specialist named Torres was sitting with a repaired encryption unit, having fixed the secondary channel issue 40 minutes ago, having reported the repair to his immediate superior, and having received no acknowledgement or updated instructions. He sat with the fixed radio. He waited. Nobody had told him what to do next, so he did the thing that the system had trained him to do, which was wait for instruction. The information existed, the solution existed, the capability existed. The connection between those three things was the only thing missing. Ava walked through the door of the primary command center, and Admiral Jonathan Reeves, decorated veteran of 4 decades in the United States Navy, looked at her the way a man looks at something he does not want to need. He said, "Commander Mitchell, what would you do?" The room held its breath. Ava looked at the maps. She looked at the screens. She looked at the Admiral, and then she said the name. Sergeant Ferris. A soldier near the back of the room looked up. "You flagged the terrain update 2 days ago," Ava said. Not a question, a statement delivered as a question to give the man the room to speak. "Yes, ma'am," Ferris said. He was young. He had the expression of a person who expected to be reprimanded for answering. "I filed it as a priority note to the mission planning review. I followed up on it the next morning. I was told it was being handled." "By whom?" Ferris looked at the floor. Then he looked at Ava. "Lieutenant Harris's office." Every head in the room turned toward Lieutenant Harris. Lieutenant Harris looked as though he had briefly forgotten how to breathe. "I received the note," Harris said. "I passed it to the mission planning team." "Which mission planning team?" Ava asked. She kept her voice completely even. She was not angry. She was not accusatory. She was simply a woman in the business of finding where information stopped traveling. The Western Sector Planning Sub-Team. And they reviewed it before finalizing the Western Corridor Plan. The silence that followed was its own answer. Ava turned back to the map. "Sergeant Ferris," she said, "if I wanted to route Alpha Team out of the Depression using terrain, they've already passed through what's the fastest safe exit corridor." And just like that, a sergeant who had been invisible for 48 hours stepped forward, walked to the map, and put his finger on exactly the right place. The command center watched. Reeves watched. The operation was not over. But something had just changed, not on the screens, in the room. The battle for the Western Corridor was still playing out across the exercise boards. Red indicators multiplying across positions, secondary units caught between outdated orders and unresponsive communication lines. The maps were honest about how badly it had gone. The numbers did not flinch. But in the primary command center, something had shifted in the air. Some invisible reorientation of gravity that everyone felt, but nobody named. Sergeant Ferris stood at that map with his finger on the alternate exit corridor, and the officers around him, men and women with twice his age and 10 times his rank, were leaning forward. Actually leaning forward. Actually looking. Ava stood beside him. "Tell them," she said. "Tell them everything you told me when I found you in the annex this morning." Ferris had not expected that. For a moment, the expression on his face was the expression of someone who had been carrying something heavy for 2 days and had just been told to set it down. He cleared his throat. "The terrain depression runs approximately 600 meters, he said, but the eastern edge of it grades back up to stable ground at the point where the secondary survey markers were placed. If Alpha Team moves northeast from their current hold position along the line of the original survey markers, they can clear the depression in approximately 9 minutes. The drone can reacquire line of sight from the northern position once they've cleared the first ridge." A planning officer named Colonel Garrett spoke up. "The secondary survey markers aren't on the current operational map." "No, sir," Ferris said. "They were placed during the mapping update. They would have been on the operational map if the update had been integrated into the mission plan." Garrett looked at the map. Then he looked at Ferris. Then he looked at Ava with an expression that was somewhere between gratitude and embarrassment, the particular combination that belongs to a man who has just realized he was sitting on the answer he needed. "Get the drone repositioned," Ava said quietly. She wasn't giving orders. She was organizing movement the way a conductor draws a performance forward without playing a single instrument. And find out where the communications specialist with the repaired secondary channel unit is. Communications Annex, said a young corporal near the back, raising her hand with the tentative energy of someone who has information and isn't sure whether sharing it is permitted. Specialist Torres fixed the secondary channel 40 minutes ago. He's been waiting for instruction. Every head turned again. The Admiral said nothing. Iva said, "Get Torres patched through to Alpha Team's field commander. Right now." 3 minutes later, Alpha Team had a working communication line. 6 minutes after that, the drone had reacquired them. 8 minutes after that, Sergeant Ferris's exit corridor was validated by aerial reconnaissance and Alpha Team was moving. They were not going to make the primary objective. The timeline was too far gone. But they were moving and they were not compromised, and the information that had been sitting in disconnected silos for 2 days was flowing now through the right channels at the right speed, reaching the right people in time to matter. The exercise ended 40 minutes later. The results board was not pretty, but it was honest. And honesty, Ava had always believed, was the only foundation on which anything real could be built. In the quiet after the exercise closed, Reeves stood at the main display for a long time. His officers had dispersed to write their reports. The room was nearly empty. The screens had shifted from operational red to the neutral gray of post-exercise assessment mode. Ava was at the back of the room collecting her notes. "Commander Mitchell," Reeves said. She looked up. I was still looking at the board. His voice had changed in the way that voices change when the performance of authority is no longer required, and only the person underneath it remains. "When you came into this room this morning," and he said, "how long had you been working on this?" Ava considered the question. "I identified the terrain issue within the first 10 minutes. The communication problem took about 20 more to trace. The encryption flag was the last thing I found about 30 minutes before the briefing started." "In 40 minutes, he said. "Yes, sir." He turned and looked at her then. Really looked. The expression on his face was something she had seen before, not often, but occasionally in rooms like this on men like him. It was the expression of someone who has just found the edge of the territory they thought they'd already mapped completely. "I owe you an apology," he said. She didn't tell him it was all right. It hadn't been all right. "Yes, sir," she said simply. "You do." And that was where part one ended, not in triumph, not in vindication, not in the clean satisfaction of being publicly proven right. It ended in a quiet room with a general and a commander standing on opposite sides of a map that had cost them a morning and taught them something that no amount of experience alone could manufacture. The lesson wasn't about being right. The lesson was about what happens when the people who can see the problem are never given the room to speak. And that lesson was only just beginning. The exercise results board had been gray for 20 minutes, but the room still felt like it was on fire. Reeves stood at the main display with his hands clasped behind his back, and the posture was the same posture he had held for 4 decades. The posture of a man in command, but something underneath it had changed in a way that everyone in the room could feel without being able to name. His officers moved carefully around him, the way people move around something that might still be hot. Nobody spoke unless spoken to. Nobody offered an opinion that hadn't been asked for. The command center had the particular atmosphere of a place where a very large and very confident thing had just broken, and everyone was pretending not to notice the pieces. Ava was at the side table writing her assessment notes when Colonel Garrett approached her. He didn't announce himself. He just appeared at her elbow and stood there for a moment, the way a man stands when he wants to say something and hasn't finished deciding whether to say it. She kept writing. "That was some work," he said finally. His voice was low, careful. The voice of a man who chose his words the way a surgeon chooses instruments. "It was other people's work," Ava said. "I just found it." Garrett was quiet for a moment. "Ferris has been trying to get that terrain report reviewed for 2 days. "I know. Harris isn't a bad officer." "I know that too," she said. She looked up from her notes. "Bad systems produce bad outcomes from good people. That's the whole point." Garrett looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded once and walked away. Across the room, Admiral Reeves had not moved. Ava watched him from the periphery of her attention, the way she watched everything without turning her head, without making it obvious. She had been watching powerful men absorb hard truths for long enough to understand the stages. First came the silence, then came the tactical recalibration, the moment where the mind, which had been operating on a certain set of assumptions, began the painful process of revising them without publicly admitting that revision was necessary. Then eventually, if the man was worth anything, came the decision about what to do next. Reeves was still in the silence phase. That was fine. She had work to do. She crossed the room to where Sergeant Ferris was standing near the secondary map station, already being interviewed by a junior assessment officer who was writing things down with the mechanical energy of someone who had been told to document everything and wasn't sure what everything meant. "Give us a minute," Ava said to the junior officer. He looked uncertain, then looked at her rank, then stepped back. Ferris watched her approach with the expression that had become familiar to her in the last hour. The expression of someone who has spent 2 days being invisible and is still adjusting to the experience of being seen. He was 26, maybe 27, clean-cut, the kind of careful, quiet competence that tends to disappear inside large organizations because it doesn't announce itself. "How long have you been at Fort Liberty?" she asked. 14 months, ma'am." "Before today, how many times did you file a concern that made it past the first review?" He didn't answer immediately. He looked at the floor, then back at her. "Twice. Both times were supply chain issues, small ones. And this time you knew it wasn't small." "Yes, ma'am." He said it without drama, just fact. "When I saw the terrain data against the mission plan, I knew exactly what was going to happen. I knew it the same way I know when an engine is about to fail before it fails. I've been in the field long enough. The numbers told a story, and the story was bad. And you filed the report." "Twice," he said. "First time the same day I saw it. Second time the next morning when I didn't get a response." "And when you followed up with Lieutenant Harris's office," his jaw tightened slightly. "The person I spoke to told me it was being handled and that I should focus on my assigned duties." Ava wrote something in her notes. "Sergeant, I'm going to need a written account of every communication you made about this issue, including timestamps, the names of every person you spoke to, and the exact language you used and received. Can you have that to me by 1800? "Yes, ma'am." "Good." She started to turn away, then stopped. "One more thing. You did everything right. I want you to know that. The system failed you, not the other way around." Ferris looked at her. His expression did something complicated. "With respect, ma'am, knowing that doesn't fix what happened out there today." She held his gaze. "No," she said, "it doesn't. That's why I need the written account." She left him there and moved toward the communications annex, where Specialist Torres was still sitting with his repaired radio unit now connected to the broader command network, but still operating with the tentative energy of someone who wasn't sure his presence had been fully authorized. He was 23 at most. He had the look of a person who had done something competent and was waiting to find out if it was going to get him in trouble. "Torres," Ava said, pulling a chair close and sitting across from him rather than standing above him. It was a deliberate choice. She had learned early that the way you positioned your body when talking to junior personnel determined about 40% of what they were willing to tell you. He straightened. "Yes, ma'am." "Walk me through the repair. When did you identify the problem?" 36 hours ago, ma'am, during the pre-exercise systems check. The secondary encryption module was showing intermittent failures. Standard diagnostics said it was within acceptable range, but the pattern of the failures didn't match the pattern I'd seen before. It looked like it was going to fail completely under load. "And you reported it?" "Yes, ma'am, to Sergeant Kowalski, my direct supervisor. He logged it and said he'd pass it up." "Did he?" Torres hesitated. The hesitation was its own answer. "I believe he did, ma'am. I followed up with him the next morning. He said it was being reviewed." "But you fixed it yourself." "I had the parts and I had the time," Torres said, "and I was pretty sure nobody was going to tell me not to fix it, so I fixed it." Ava almost smiled. "And then you sat in the annex for 40 minutes with a working radio while Alpha Team couldn't communicate with command." He looked at his hands. "Nobody told me what to do with it once it was fixed, ma'am. I didn't want to assume." "Torres in the future," she said, and she said it gently but clearly. "When you fix a critical communication system during an active exercise, you walk it directly to the watch officer and you put it in his hands personally. You don't wait for instruction. The fix itself is the instruction." He nodded, absorbing this. "Yes, ma'am." "You also did everything right," she said. "Within the limits of what you were told the system expected from you. The problem isn't your judgment. The problem is what the system taught you to expect your judgment was worth. Torres looked at her with the expression of someone hearing a thing articulated that they had felt, but never found language for. She stood up. I need your written account too. Same format as Ferris. Timestamps, names, exact language. 1800. Yes, ma'am. She was halfway to the door when his voice caught her. Ma'am, she turned. Torres was looking at her with something that wasn't quite a question and wasn't quite a statement. The Admiral, he was angry when you left this morning. I know. Is he going to? Torres stopped himself. Started again. Is this going to be okay for Ferris and me? Ava looked at him steadily. That depends on decisions that haven't been made yet, she said. But I'll tell you this, by tonight the people who need to know your names will know them. And they'll know them for the right reasons. She walked back toward the main command center, and she was 3 steps from the door when it opened from the inside and Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Webb stepped through. Webb was Reeves's senior aide, a man who had been at the Admiral's side for 7 years and had the particular quality of total personal efficiency that tends to develop in people who have spent a long time managing a powerful man's relationship with reality. Webb looked at her without expression. The Admiral wants to see you, he said, privately. Now, yes, ma'am. She followed him down the corridor to the secondary conference room that served as Reeves's personal working space during exercises. It was a small room functional, no theater to it. A table chairs, a wall screen currently showing the post-exercise assessment summary. Reeves was standing at the window when she entered. He didn't turn immediately. Webb left and closed the door. Reeves said without turning. How long have you been doing this? She waited a beat. Doing what, sir? He turned then. This. What you did today. Walking into a room and seeing what everyone else missed. I didn't see anything everyone else missed, she said. I found what Ferris saw and Torres saw and the drone technician saw. The information existed. I just looked for it in the places where it had stopped moving. That's not nothing, he said. No, she agreed, it's not. He sat down at the table, which was something she hadn't seen him do without ceremony before. It was the movement of a man who was no longer performing being in charge and was simply existing in a room tired with the weight of the morning on him. I've been in the Navy for 41 years, he said. I've commanded operations that you cannot read about in any public document. I have made decisions that cost men their lives and decisions that saved them. And I have spent 4 decades building a system of judgment that I trusted completely. He paused. Today, that system failed. The system failed because it stopped accepting input, Ava said. Your judgment isn't the problem. It's the architecture around your judgment. When the people closest to the ground can't get information to the people making decisions, the decisions get made in a vacuum. And vacuums are where plans go to die. Reeves looked at her. I threw you out of my briefing room. You did. And you were right. Yes, sir. And I was wrong. She didn't fill the silence. She had learned that filling silences like this one was a mistake. Some things needed to be said completely without assistance, or they didn't count. I was wrong, he said again. And the second time he said it, it sounded different. Harder. More real. Like a man pressing a bruise to confirm it's there. Sir, she said, what happens in the next 48 hours will matter more than what happened this morning. What you do with this is the question. He looked at her for a long moment. What would you do? It was the second time he'd asked her that today. The first time in the crisis, it had been tactical. This time it was different. This time it was the question of a man who was genuinely asking. Not commanding, not performing inquiry, but actually reaching for an answer he didn't have. I would hold a full review, she said. Not a blame review, a structural review. I would look at every communication failure in the last 72 hours and trace it backward to where it started. I would bring in the junior personnel who filed the reports, and I would let them walk the senior officers through exactly what happened, in front of each other. Not because you need to embarrass anyone, but because the only way to fix a communication problem is to show the people in the system exactly where and how the communication broke. That will be uncomfortable, he said. Yes, sir, that's why it will work. He was quiet for a moment. Then the assessment team's report. When does it go up the chain? My report is due in 72 hours, she said. It goes to SOCOM Assessment Division in the Joint Readiness Command. Reeves absorbed this. What will it say? The truth, she said simply. which is that this base has significant structural communication failures between ground-level personnel and senior command, that those failures directly produce the exercise outcome today, and that the conditions for correction exist and could be implemented with proper leadership support. She paused. What it says about the leadership response will depend on what the leadership response is. He looked at her for a long moment. She held the look without challenge and without deference. Just clearly. "You're not afraid of me," he said. It was almost a question. "No, sir," she said. "I'm not afraid of you." He stood up. Something in the way he moved had changed from the morning, some specific quality of his presence that she could feel but not easily describe. The mass was still there. The authority was still there, but something that had been rigid had shifted. Not broken, but shifted the way a ship shifts in the water when it takes on a different orientation to the wind. "I'll convene the structural review at 0800 tomorrow," he said. "I want you running it." She hadn't expected that. She showed nothing. "That you will create resistance," she said carefully. "I know. Several of your senior officers will not respond well to a commander with my rank running a review that documents their failures." "I know that too," he said. "Do you want the assignment or not?" She looked at him. In that moment, she was making a different kind of assessment than the one she had been making all day. She was assessing not a plan or a communication network or a chain of information, but a man. She was reading the specific quality of his commitment, whether it was real or whether it was the temporary sincerity of someone still in the shock of a bad morning who would revise their position in 12 hours when the initial discomfort faded. What she saw surprised her slightly. He meant it. "Yes, sir," she said. "I want the assignment." "Good." He moved toward the door, then stopped with his hand on the frame. He didn't turn around. "Commander Mitchell, this morning in the briefing room." She waited. "What you said when you left, that you wanted me to remember, you told me." He paused. "I want you to know that I will remember it. Not the way you might think. Not because it made me look bad, but because it was the last moment I had to prevent what happened, and I threw it away." His voice was even but not empty. "A man should remember those moments." He left. She stood in the empty room for a moment, looking at the post-exercise assessment summary still running on the wall screen. The numbers were what they were, red where they should have been green, zeros where there should have been movement. The honest record of a morning where the gap between what was known and what was heard had cost a training operation its western corridor. She thought about Ferris in the annex at 0500 filing his second report. She thought about Torres sitting alone with a fixed radio waiting for someone to tell him he was allowed to use it. She thought about the drone technician who had flagged the battery problem twice and been told it was within acceptable range. She thought about all the small, critical, invisible people who had seen the shape of the disaster coming and had done exactly what the system told them to do with that information, which was to route it upward through channels that were not designed to receive it. She picked up her notepad. There was a knock at the conference room door. "Come in," she said. It was Major Holt, his expression carrying the specific energy of a man who has information and has been waiting for the right moment to deliver it. He stepped inside and closed the door behind him. "You're going to want to hear this," he said. "Tell me." The drone technician, Holt said, "Specialist Amara Webb, not related to the colonel. She's 24. She filed the battery warning twice, you already know that. What you don't know is that she was informally told by her shift supervisor that if she kept filing what he called marginal concerns, she'd be transferred out of the drone operations unit." Ava set her pen down. "He threatened her assignment," she said. "He told her, and I'm quoting from what she told Chen 20 minutes ago, that there was a difference between a problem and a preference, and that if she couldn't tell the difference, she wasn't cut out for drone ops." The room was quiet for a moment. "Who's the shift supervisor?" Ava asked. "Master Sergeant Dale Pruitt, 12 years in drone operations. He's considered highly competent." "Where is he now?" "Still on the exercise floor, ma'am, running post-exercise diagnostics." Ava picked up her pen, wrote the name, set the pen down again, stood up. "Get Chenin," she said. "I want Webb's full account documented before 1800, and I want it separate from Ferris and Torres. 3 independent accounts, full detail, no cross-contamination." Holt nodded. He didn't move immediately. "Ava." He almost never used her first name. It meant something when he did. "This is bigger than the exercise." "I know," she said. "When this report goes up to SOCOM, I know Derek. People are going to push back hard, not just Pruitt, people above Pruitt. She looked at him steadily. Have I ever stopped because people push back? He was quiet for a moment. Then he almost smiled, the specific half expression that was as close as Derek Holt got to warmth. No, you haven't. Then let's get to work. What happened in the next 4 hours was the kind of work that doesn't look like work from the outside. It was conversations mostly. Ava moving from room to room across the base, sitting down across from people who had been invisible for days or weeks or months, asking questions in the particular way she had developed over years of this specific kind of operation. Not interrogation, not extraction, not the formal interview that puts people on guard and produces carefully managed versions of the truth, but conversation. The kind of conversation where the person across from you gradually understands that you are genuinely asking that what they say will not be weaponized against them, that the room they're sitting in is the one place today where what they actually know is more valuable than what they're supposed to say. She found a logistics corporal named Mendez who had noticed that the convoy routes were being run on a predictable schedule and had mentioned it to his team leader 3 weeks earlier. The team leader had said it wasn't his problem to solve. Mendez had written a brief, informal memo. The memo had gone nowhere. She found a communications specialist named Park, who had identified a redundancy gap in the backup communication protocol 8 months ago and had submitted a formal improvement proposal that was still sitting in a review queue somewhere in the administrative system. Unread, undecided, existing in the specific bureaucratic purgatory where important things go when they're not urgent enough to force immediate action and not small enough to be dismissed outright. She found a supply sergeant named Rodriguez, who had been quietly maintaining a personal log of convoy timing issues for 6 months because he had developed the conviction that something was eventually going to go wrong, and he wanted a record. He had never submitted the log formally because nobody had ever asked him for it, and he hadn't been sure he was supposed to have it. She collected these accounts the way a careful person collects evidence, methodically without reaction, without editorializing, with a consistent and genuine attention that makes people feel that what they're saying is being received rather than processed. By 1700, she had 11 separate accounts. By 1800, she had 14. By 1900, she had written the structural architecture of a report that was going to change something about the way Fort Liberty communicated with itself, and possibly something about the way the larger command structure understood the relationship between rank and knowledge. She was in the assessment team's workspace surrounded by notes when Colonel Garrett knocked on the open door. "The Admiral wants an informal briefing," he said. "Tonight, 2000. Tell him I'll be there." Garrett lingered. He had the expression he'd had earlier, the one that was somewhere between respect and the discomfort of a man who is revising a previous judgment and finding the revision uncomfortable. "Mitchell," he said. She looked up. "I was in that briefing room this morning when Reeves threw you out." He said it without flinching. "I laughed." She held his gaze. "I know," she said. "Oh, Shen." He held the gaze. "That won't happen again." She nodded once. "I appreciate that, Colonel." He left. She looked back at her notes. Outside in the corridor, she could hear the base settling into its evening routine, the shift change conversations, the distant mechanical sounds of equipment being secured, the specific ambient sound of a large organization processing a difficult day. Fort Liberty was not a broken place. It never had been. It was a place full of capable, committed, serious people who had been operating inside a system that had stopped letting their capability reach the places where it was needed. That was fixable. Not easily, not quickly, not without resistance from people whose authority had been built on the existing architecture. But fixable. At 1945, she gathered her materials and walked toward the Admiral's conference room, and she was passing the corridor junction near the communications annex when she heard a voice behind her. "Commander Mitchell." She turned. It was Specialist Torres. He was off duty now, out of uniform in the technical sense, in a base-issue jacket rather than his operations gear. He was holding a folded piece of paper. "I finished the written account," he said. "I know you said 1800. I'm sorry it's late." She took the paper. "Thank you, Torres." He started to turn away. "Torres," she said. He stopped. "What made you fix the radio yourself when you could have just logged the issue and waited?" "I thought about it for a moment. Because the exercise was starting," he said slowly. "And I knew that if the radio wasn't fixed, someone in the field wasn't going to be able to talk to command when they needed to. And I had the parts, and I knew how. He paused. It seemed like the obvious thing to do. She looked at him, 23 years old, sitting alone in an annex with a fixed radio waiting for someone to tell him his solution was allowed. It was the obvious thing to do, she said. Don't ever stop thinking that way. He nodded, turned and walked back down the corridor. She watched him go for a moment, then unfolded his written account and read the first paragraph, standing in the corridor. And what she read confirmed everything she already knew and added 2 details she hadn't had before. She folded it back up and put it in her materials. At 2000 exactly, she walked into Admiral Reeves's conference room. All was there, so was Garrett, so was the chief of staff, a 2-star named Admiral Patricia Wren, who had arrived from the regional command an hour earlier, and whose presence in the room meant that the day's events had already traveled further up the chain than anyone had publicly acknowledged. Wren looked at Ava with sharp, assessing eyes. "Commander Mitchell," she said, "I've been hearing about you all afternoon." "Admiral Wren," Ava said. Wren looked at Reeves, then back at Ava. "Sit down, Commander, and start from the beginning." Ava sat down. She opened her notes, and she began. Admiral Patricia Wren did not take notes. She never did. In 32 years of naval service, she had developed the particular skill of absolute retention, the ability to sit across from a person and absorb everything they said without the intermediary of pen and paper, without the performance of documentation. She just listened, and what she heard she kept. She had been listening to Ava Mitchell for 11 minutes when she held up one hand. "Stop," she said. The room went still. Wren looked at Reeves. She looked at him the way a person looks at someone they have known for a long time and have just seen do something that requires careful reconsideration. "Jonathan," she said, and the use of his first name in this context landed in the room like a stone in still water. "You knew she was on the assessment team before the briefing." It was not a question. Reeves said yes. "And you removed her anyway?" "Yes." Wren was quiet for a moment. The quality of her silence was different from Reeves's silence. His silence was the silence of a man processing. Hers was the silence of a woman who had already processed and was now deciding what to do with the result. "Continue," she said to Ava. Ava continued. She laid out the 14 accounts in the order she had collected them, not chronologically by when the individual concerns had been raised, but structurally by where in the command chain each concern had stopped traveling. She did not editorialize. She did not assign blame by name, though the names were in her notes and available if asked for. She described the architecture of the failure, the way an engineer describes a structural problem. Here is the load-bearing element. Here is where the stress concentrated. Here is the point of failure. Here is what the failure produced. When she finished, the room was quiet for a long moment. Garrett cleared his throat. 14 separate reports, he said, in 72 hours. 14 that I found, Ava said. I had 4 hours. A full audit would almost certainly surface more. Wren looked at Reeves again. Something passed between them, the compressed communication of 2 people who have worked at the same level for long enough that full sentences are sometimes unnecessary. Then Wren looked at Ava. The formal report goes to SOCOM in 72 hours, she said. Yes, ma'am. I want a preliminary summary on my desk by 0600 tomorrow. Yes, ma'am. Wren stood. The meeting was over. But at the door she stopped, and she turned back, and she looked at Ava with an expression that was harder to read than anything else in the room had been. Commander Mitchell, she said, how long have you been doing this kind of work? 6 years, ma'am, in various forms. And in 6 years, how many times has the command structure you were assessing responded the way Admiral Reeves responded today? Ava thought about it honestly. Twice, she said, including today. Wren nodded slowly. That's a damning number, she said, and she left. The room exhaled. Reeves looked at Ava. He looked at Garrett. He looked at his hands on the table, then back at Ava. 0600, he said. The structural review convenes. Yes, sir. I want you to run it exactly the way you described this afternoon. The junior personnel present, the senior officers present, in the same room. There will be resistance, she said again. From whom specifically? His voice was flat, controlled. Master Sergeant Pruitt, for one, she said. What he said to Specialist Webb constitutes informal intimidation of a reporting party. When that comes out in the review, and it will come out, he's going to push back hard. He has allies in the drone operations chain. He can push back all he wants, Reeves said, in writing, through proper channels. The particular emphasis he put on the last two words was its own statement. Garrett almost smiled. Ava gathered her materials and stood. "One more thing," Reeves said, "this morning, in the briefing room." He didn't look away from her. "I called you a little brat." "Yes, sir." "In front of 43 officers and 5,000 soldiers watching the live broadcast." "Yes, sir." "That was wrong." He said it without softening it, without the diplomatic language that powerful men use to apologize, without fully apologizing. Not just tactically wrong, wrong as a matter of conduct and decency. I want that acknowledged. Ava looked at him for a moment. "Acknowledged, sir," she said, and accepted. She left the conference room, and the night air of Fort Liberty hit her like a reset. She stood outside for exactly 30 seconds, which was the amount of time she allowed herself to feel things before putting them back in the place where she kept them, the place where experiences were stored for later examination rather than immediate processing. Then she walked back to the assessment workspace. Holt was still there. Chen had gone to the barracks. Holt was at the desk with 3 coffee cups in varying stages of empty and the expression of a man who has been working for 16 hours and has decided that stopping is not an option. "How did it go?" he said. Ren was there. Holt sat up straighter. 2-star. "Yes. That changes the scope." "Significantly," Ava said. She sat down and opened her notes. "Preliminary summary due 0600, structural review at 0800. I need you to organize the accounts by command level and cross-reference them against the official communication logs from the last 72 hours. Looking for discrepancies," he said. "Looking for the places where the official log says a communication was received and reviewed, and the person who sent it says otherwise." Holt was already moving, pulling files, opening his laptop. He had worked with Ava long enough to not need things explained twice, and to understand that her requests, which always sounded straightforward, were usually the surface of something considerably deeper. "How bad is it going to be?" Shamani said. "Not dramatically, just asking." "Depends on what the logs show," she said. "If what I think I'm going to find is what I find, then this isn't just a training exercise failure. It's a systemic reporting suppression issue that's been operating at this base for at least 8 months. Holt stopped typing. He looked at her. 8 months, he said. Park's proposal, the redundancy gap in the backup communication protocol, filed 8 months ago, still in review. She looked at him steadily. If that proposal had been implemented, Torres's repaired radio unit would have been automatically routed to the watch officer, without Torres needing to wait for instruction. Alpha Team would have had communication restored 11 minutes faster. Holt was quiet for a moment. "That's not a training failure." "No," she said, "it's not." They worked through the night. At 0300, Holt found the first discrepancy. An official communication log entry dated 3 weeks prior showed a notation that Corporal Mendez's convoy timing concern had been reviewed and assessed as within operational parameters. The notation was initialed by a logistics supervisor named Chief Warrant Officer Daniels, but Mendez's account stated clearly that he had never received any response to his memo at all, and that the only conversation he'd had about it was the informal one with his team leader who had told him it wasn't his problem. Either the log was wrong or Mendez's account was wrong. Holt looked at Ava across the table. "Someone created a false log entry," he said. "Or someone made a notation about a review that never happened," she said carefully, "which is either deliberate falsification or administrative negligence. We need to determine which." "How?" "Pull Daniels's calendar for that week," she said. "If he was at the location and the meeting is on his schedule, it's possible there was a conversation Mendez didn't register as formal. If he wasn't there, then someone documented a review that didn't happen," Holt said. "Pull the calendar." By 0400, they had pulled 3 more logs that showed similar discrepancies. Concern filed responses documented in the official record, no corresponding awareness in the accounts of the people who had filed them. It was not on its own proof of deliberate falsification. Bureaucratic systems produce these kinds of gaps, routinely messages sent and not received, notations made about intended actions that were never completed, the ordinary entropy of large organizations managing enormous amounts of information. But the pattern had a specific shape, and the shape was not random. Every discrepancy clustered around reports that would have required either significant resource investment or uncomfortable acknowledgement of planning vulnerabilities to address. The small, easily fixed concerns had clear paper trails. The complex, uncomfortable ones had the specific kind of documentation that looked correct from a distance and fell apart under close examination. Ava set down her coffee. "Derek," she said. He looked up. "This is bigger than Fort Liberty." He was quiet for a moment. "How much bigger?" "I don't know yet, but the pattern in these logs matches a pattern I saw in a base assessment I ran 2 years ago in a different command. That one was classified at a level that prevented me from including the full findings in the public report." She paused. "The base commander at that assessment is currently serving in a regional command advisory role." Holt held very still. "You're saying this isn't isolated?" "I'm saying I need to know if it's isolated before the report goes to SOCOM," she said. "Because if it isn't, then what I write in the next 72 hours matters in a way that goes well beyond Fort Liberty's exercise results." Holt looked at her for a long moment. "What do you need?" "I need access to the communication audit logs from the base assessment 2 years ago. They're in the classified archive. I'll need Wren's authorization to pull them." "You're going to call Wren at 0400. "No," she said. "I'm going to have the request on her desk when she arrives at 0530, with enough of the current log discrepancies attached that she understands why it can't wait." She started writing. At 0515, she walked the preliminary summary in the archive request to Wren's aide and watched him carry it inside. She stood outside for a moment in the pre-dawn quiet of the base. The sky, the specific gray-blue that exists for about 40 minutes before sunrise. The air cool enough to feel real after hours of recycled indoor air. Her phone buzzed, a message from a number she didn't recognize. Fort Liberty Internal System. It said Commander Mitchell. A word before the review, 7:30, my office, MSG Pruitt. She read it twice. Then she put her phone in her pocket and walked back inside. She didn't respond. At 0600, Wren's aide found her in the assessment workspace. "Admiral Wren reviewed your preliminary summary," he said. "The archive request is approved. The files will be available to your secure terminal by 0700. He paused. "The Admiral also added a notation to your request." "What notation?" He handed her a slip of paper. Wren's handwriting was economical and precise. The notation said, "The pattern you've identified is consistent with what I've been seeing for 18 months. We need to talk after the review. Do not discuss this with anyone before then, including Reeves." Ava read it 3 times. Then she folded the paper and put it in the inside pocket of her uniform jacket against her chest. At 0700, she pulled the classified archive files from the assessment 2 years prior. She had 45 minutes before the structural review convened. She used every one of them. What she found in those files made the Fort Liberty discrepancies look like a rough draft. The base 2 years ago, Fort Calder, had shown the same pattern of communication suppression, but at a more advanced stage. Concerns that were filed, logged as reviewed, never actually addressed. Junior personnel quietly transferred or reassigned after filing multiple reports. A paper architecture of responsiveness built over an actual practice of containment, and at the center of it, a logistics and communications supervisor who had been present at Fort Calder 2 years ago and was currently serving at a regional command in a position that gave him advisory authority over communication protocol standards across 11 bases, including Fort Liberty. His name was Colonel Raymond Hess. Ava sat with that name for a moment. She had met Hess once briefly at a joint readiness conference 14 months ago. He had seemed competent, well-organized, the kind of officer who inspired confidence in formal settings. She had not thought about him again until this moment. She thought about him now. At 0800, she walked into the structural review. The room was arranged exactly as she had requested, junior personnel on one side of the table, senior officers on the other. The physical separation, deliberate and visible enough to communicate something without requiring it to be said. He said. Sergeant Ferris was there, his expression controlled but alert. Specialist Torres was there, sitting very straight, clearly having decided that whatever happened today, he was going to meet it with his back upright. Specialist Webb was there, Amara Webb, the drone technician, who had been told that filing too many concerns might cost her her assignment. She was 24 years old, and she sat with her hands flat on the table in front of her, and the quality of her stillness was the stillness of someone who has decided to stop being afraid of something. On the senior side, Colonel Garrett, 2 lieutenant colonels, a major from logistics, and at the end of the table, Master Sergeant Dale Pruitt. Pruitt was 51, 22 years in drone operations, the specific kind of confident that comes from being considered an expert for long enough that the distinction between confidence and certainty has blurred. He sat with his arms crossed and his expression neutral in a way that was not actually neutral. Admiral Reeves was not in the room. That had been Ava's specific request, and he had granted it without asking why, which told her that he understood why. She took her position at the head of the table. "This review is not a disciplinary proceeding," she said. "It is a structural assessment. Now, what we're looking at today is how information moved where it stopped and what the effects of that stoppage were. Everything said in this room is part of the formal assessment record. Nothing said in this room will be used as the sole basis for disciplinary action without independent corroboration." She looked at both sides of the table. "That protection applies equally to everyone in this room. Is that understood?" Nods from most of them. Pruitt didn't nod, she noticed. "We'll start with the drone battery warning," she said. "Specialist Webb, I'd like you to walk us through what you observed when you reported it and what response you received." Webb took a breath. She looked at her hands for 1 second, then looked up. "I identified the battery variance in the primary drone unit during the pre-exercise check at approximately 1400 hours 2 days before the exercise. The variance was within the technical tolerance range, but the pattern of it was inconsistent with normal degradation. In my experience, that specific pattern precedes a failure under load rather than a gradual decline." "And you reported it," Ava said. "Yes, ma'am. I filed a priority concern at 1420. I followed up verbally with my shift supervisor at approximately 1600 the same day." She paused. "Master Sergeant Pruitt." Every eye in the room moved to it. He didn't move. "What was Master Sergeant Pruitt's response?" Ava asked. Webb looked at Pruitt for exactly 1 second. Then she looked back at Ava. "He told me that the reading was within tolerance and that I was conflating a preference for a different unit with an actual operational concern. He told me that if I couldn't distinguish between the two, I might not be suited for the drone operations role." The room had gone very still. Ava let the stillness sit for a moment. She looked at Pruitt. "Master Sergeant Pruitt, is that an accurate account of your response?" Pruitt uncrossed his arms. He leaned forward slightly. "With respect, Commander, what I said was that the reading was within tolerance. The rest is the specialist's interpretation of a routine feedback conversation." "Routine feedback," Ava repeated. "Yes, ma'am. The drone lost contact with Alpha Team at minute 4 of the exercise," she said. "The specific failure mode was battery-related power interruption affecting the signal stability system. The failure occurred under load in a pattern consistent with what Specialist described when she filed her concern 2 days prior." She paused. "Would you characterize her concern as a preference or an operational warning?" Pruitt's jaw tightened. "In retrospect—" "I'm not asking about retrospect," Ava said, and her voice was completely even. "I'm asking you to characterize the concern as she filed it at the time she filed it, given what you now know about how the failure actually presented." He was quiet for a moment. The room waited. "It was an operational warning," he said finally. Ferris across the table exhaled very quietly. "Thank you," Ava said. She made a notation. "And when you told Specialist Webb that she might not be suited for drone operations if she couldn't distinguish between preferences and concerns, what effect do you believe that had on her subsequent reporting behavior?" Pruitt looked at her. She could see him calculating. She had seen this calculation before in rooms like this one on faces like his. He was deciding whether to fight or manage, whether the direct approach or the incremental retreat was more survivable. "I don't know," he said. "Specialist Webb," Ava said without looking away from Pruitt, "did that conversation affect your subsequent reporting behavior?" Webb's voice was steady. "Yes, ma'am, I did not file a second concern about the battery issue. I considered filing one the following morning when the variance increased slightly, but I decided against it." The room sat with that. Ava let it sit for a full 5 seconds. 5 seconds was a long time in a silent room. Long enough for everyone at the table to do the arithmetic themselves without her having to do it for them. If Webb had filed a second concern, it would have created a second documented warning. A second documented warning attached to the first would have been considerably harder to route around without acknowledgement. The drone might have been replaced or repaired before the exercise. Alpha Team might have maintained surveillance coverage. The Western Corridor might have held. 5 seconds. Pruitt seemed to feel the arithmetic happening around him. His expression had changed. The neutral calculation was gone. What was underneath it was harder to read but unmistakably real. I was not aware, he said, that the specialist had considered a second filing and decided against it. No, Ava said, you weren't, because the effect of the conversation you had with her was to move her decision-making about what to report from the operational domain into the personal risk domain. She stopped asking whether the concern was real and started asking whether filing it would cost her. She looked at him steadily. That is the definition of a suppressed reporting environment, Master Sergeant, and it is the single most dangerous condition that can exist in an operational unit. Pruitt said nothing. The lieutenant colonel from logistics said, with respect, Commander, is there evidence that this was intentional on the Master Sergeant's part, or are we looking at a communication failure that intent determines culpability in a disciplinary proceeding? Ava said. This is not a disciplinary proceeding. In a structural assessment, intent is secondary to effect. The effect was a suppressed report. The suppressed report contributed to an operational failure. That is the structural finding regardless of intent. The lieutenant colonel sat back. Garrett, who had been quiet since the review began, said, "What's the remedy?" "I'll come to remedies," Ava said. "We're not done with the findings." She moved through the next two accounts with the same method. Webb's account, Ferris's account, Torres's account. Each one laid out with the same careful structure, the same attention to where information had stopped traveling and what the effect of that stoppage had been. Each account built on the previous one. Each one added a layer to the picture that was emerging not of individual failures, but of a system that had developed specific habits around the management of uncomfortable information. At 9:45, she reached the log discrepancies. She had not announced that she was going to address them. She simply placed printed copies of 4 specific log entries on the table and slid them to the senior officer's side. These are official communication log entries from the 72 hours preceding the exercise, she said. Each one documents a concern as having been received and reviewed. In each case, the person who filed the concern has provided a sworn account stating that they received no response and no acknowledgement. I'd like the relevant supervisors to explain the discrepancy. The room went very quiet. The lieutenant colonel from logistics picked up one of the pages. He read it. His expression changed in the specific way that expressions change when a person realizes that the paper in their hand is more serious than the paper in their hand looked 30 seconds ago. "This is Mendez's convoy concern," he said. "Yes," Ava said. "The log shows Chief Warrant Officer Daniels reviewed and assessed it." "Yes." "And Mendez says he received no response." "Yes." The lieutenant colonel set the paper down. He looked at his own hands for a moment. Then he looked up at Ava. "I need to speak to Daniels before I can address this." "You'll have that opportunity," she said. "The review is creating a record. The record goes to SOCOM Assessment Division. The discrepancies will be investigated by the appropriate authority." She looked at everyone at the table. "What I need from this room today is not explanations of the discrepancies. I need acknowledgement that the discrepancies exist, that they are real, that they represent a gap between the official record and operational reality. Can I have that acknowledgement from the senior personnel present?" There was a pause. Garrett said yes. The logistics lieutenant colonel said yes. The second lieutenant colonel said yes. The major said yes. Pruitt said nothing. Ava looked at him. "Master Sergeant Pruitt," she said, "the discrepancies as I've described them, do you acknowledge their existence in the record?" He looked at her. He looked at the papers on the table. He looked at the wall behind her head for a moment, the specific avoidance of someone running an internal calculation at high speed. "I acknowledge," he said slowly, "that there are entries in the log that require clarification." "That's not what I asked," she said. The room had gone absolutely still. "I asked whether you acknowledge that the discrepancies exist, that what is in the official log does not match what is in the accounts of the individuals who filed the concerns." Another pause. "Yes," he said. And then, as if the word cost him something physical, "I acknowledge that." Ava made a notation. She continued. At 1100, she reached the remedies section. She outlined 6 specific structural changes, each one targeting a specific failure point that the review had identified a new mandatory acknowledgement protocol for all filed operational concerns above a threshold severity rating, an anonymous secondary reporting channel that bypassed the direct supervisor chain and routed to the base operations officer quarterly communication audits conducted by personnel outside the unit being audited, a formal protection protocol for personnel who filed multiple concerns on the same issue, mandatory training for all supervisory personnel on the operational consequences of report suppression, and a review board for all log entries showing concern receipt without corresponding contact with the filing party. She presented each one without preamble or elaboration beyond what was structurally necessary. The room listened. Nobody interrupted. When she finished, Garrett said, "How long to implement?" "The protocol changes can be live within 30 days, she said. "The training program takes 60 to 90 days to build properly. The audit structure can be operational in 45. "Resources, modest, she said. "The biggest cost is supervisory time, not budget." He nodded. He looked at the other senior officers. Something was passing between them, not a vote and not a negotiation, but the particular collective recalibration of people who have just spent 3 hours in a room where reality was significantly different from what they expected and have decided individually and more or less simultaneously to accept the difference. "What happens to Pruitt?" the logistics lieutenant colonel said. He asked it quietly, not defensively, just a question that needed to be asked. "That's outside the scope of this review," Ava said. "The structural finding is documented. The relevant authority makes the personnel determination." Pruitt's jaw was set. He had not spoken since acknowledging the discrepancies. He was not the kind of man who fell apart under pressure. He was the kind of man who compressed, who took the weight of a bad situation and converted it into controlled forward energy. He would be filing something tonight, she knew. A response, a counterstatement, a formal grievance. He had allies. He had 22 years of institutional relationships. He would use them. She expected that. She had documented everything. At 11:45, she closed the review. As the room began to disperse, Webb caught Ava near the door. She waited until most of the others had left. She was 24 years old, and she had spent the last 3 hours sitting at a table where the most senior people on the base had been asked formally and on the record to acknowledge that she had been right. "Commander Mitchell," she said. Her voice was careful, like she was testing the weight of the air before putting words into it. Ava looked at her. "If I had filed the second concern," Webb said, "the one I decided not to file, would it have changed what happened?" Ava thought about it honestly. "It might have," she said. "It might have created enough documented evidence to force a review of the drone unit before the exercise. I can't tell you for certain. What I can tell you is that your instinct about the battery failure was correct. And the reason you didn't file again was because someone told you that filing would cost you. That's not your failure, Specialist Webb. That's the system's failure." Webb was quiet for a moment, then she said something that Ava didn't expect. "I'm going to stay in drone ops," she said, "in case you were wondering." Ava looked at her. "Good," she said. Webb left. Ava stood in the empty review room for a moment, surrounded by the paper record of a morning that had pulled Fort Liberty's internal reality out into the light where it could finally be seen. She thought about Wren's notation, 18 months, the pattern consistent with what Wren had been seeing for 18 months. She thought about Hess, Fort Calder, the communication protocol advisory role that gave him reach across 11 bases. She thought about the 6 remedies she had just presented, each one specific and structural and achievable within 90 days, each one designed to address a failure that should never have been allowed to develop in the first place. And she thought about a 23-year-old specialist sitting alone in a communications annex with a working radio waiting for someone to tell him his solution was allowed. The review was over. The real work was just beginning. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. "Wren, one line my office." Now, Wren's office was on the second floor of the administrative command building, a corner room that looked out over the main training ground. Ava had never been inside it before. She noticed when she entered that the walls held no photographs, no commendations displayed for visitors, no personal artifacts of any kind. Just maps, current ones. The kind of office that belonged to a person who was always working, never performing. Wren was standing at her desk when Ava entered. Not sitting, standing with a folder open in front of her in the expression of a person who has been thinking hard about something for a long time and has just reached the point where thinking alone is no longer sufficient. She looked up. Close the door. Ava closed it. Sit down. She sat. Ren remained standing. She picked up the folder and held it for a moment, without opening it, the gesture of someone deciding how to begin. Then she set it down, turned it around, and slid it across the desk to Ava. Open it, she said. Ava opened it. The first page was a communication audit from Fort Calder dated 16 months ago. The second page was a similar audit from Naval Station Pendleton. The third was from Camp Lejeune. Each one documented the same pattern concerns, filed officially logged as reviewed. No corresponding awareness in the filing party's junior personnel, quietly reassigned after persistent reporting log entries that looked clean from a distance and fractured under close examination. 4 bases, 4 separate instances of the same systemic architecture. And at the center of each audit, appearing in different roles but always present, always adjacent to the communication chain, where the failures concentrated, Colonel Raymond Hess. Ava looked up from the folder. You've been building this for 18 months, she said. Trying to, Ren said. Every time I got close enough to document it properly, something shifted. Hess moved to a new role. The audit window closed. The personnel who could corroborate the pattern got transferred before I could get their formal accounts. She looked at Ava steadily. I've been watching him manage his exposure for a year and a half. He's very good at it. Where is he now? Regional Command Advisory. Communication protocol standards across 11 bases. Ren paused, including Fort Liberty. Ava looked back at the folder. She thought about the log discrepancy she had found in 4 hours of work. She thought about the 8 months that Park's redundancy proposal had been sitting in a review queue. She thought about who had been at Fort Calder 2 years ago in a drone operations role and who was now at Fort Liberty and who had told a 24-year-old specialist that filing too many concerns might cost her her assignment. Pruitt, she said. Ren nodded once. He worked directly under Hess at Fort Calder. The room was very quiet. You think Pruitt is operating on instruction? Ava said. I think Pruitt absorbed a management philosophy from someone he spent 2 years working under, Ren said carefully. Whether the instruction is explicit or cultural is something the investigation will need to determine. What I know is that the pattern of behavior at Fort Liberty matches the pattern at Fort Calder with a consistency that is statistically improbable if the 2 situations are genuinely independent. Ava closed the folder. She set it on the desk between them. What do you need from me? She said. Your SOCOM report, Ren said. The one due in 72 hours. If it documents only the Fort Liberty findings, it goes into the standard review process, and Hess has time to manage his exposure again. He has people in the review process. He's been managing this for 18 months precisely because he understands which channels the information travels through and how to position himself adjacent to those channels. She looked at Ava. But if your report documents the pattern, not just the instance, and requests a cross-base audit under independent authority, it bypasses the standard channels entirely. It goes to the Inspector General's office and the SOCOM Commanding General simultaneously. That's a significant escalation, Ava said. Yes, Ren said, it is. And if I'm wrong about the pattern, if the Fort Liberty discrepancies are genuinely independent of Fort Calder and the other bases, then the cross-base audit finds that, and the report reflects it, Ren said. You're not making an accusation in the report. You're documenting a pattern and requesting an investigation. That's within the standard scope of an assessment team's authority. Ava looked at the folder on the desk. If Hess realizes what's in the report before it's filed, she said, he'll move to discredit the Fort Liberty findings before they reach the IG's office. He'll need to. If the pattern holds, the Fort Liberty exercise outcome becomes part of a much larger record. Yes, Ren said, which is why I need you to understand exactly what you're filing and why before you file it. Once that report goes up, there is no quiet version of what happens next. Ava thought about Ferris, who had filed his concern twice and been told it was being handled. She thought about Torres waiting in the annex. She thought about Webb, 24 years old, deciding not to file a second concern because the first one had cost her a threat. She thought about Park's proposal 8 months in a queue. She thought about Mendez and his personal log that nobody had asked for, that he had kept because he had decided to maintain his own private record of a reality that the official system was choosing not to see. She thought about all the other bases, all the other Ferrises, all the other Webbs. I'll need access to the Fort Calder audit files and the Pendleton files, she said, under my assessment authorization. Already requested, Wren said. They'll be on your secure terminal within the hour. And I'll need an independent corroborator for the pattern findings, someone outside the Fort Liberty chain who can validate the cross-base analysis before the report goes up. I have someone, Wren said. Colonel Dana Forsyth. She ran the Pendleton assessment 14 months ago. She's been sitting on findings she couldn't corroborate in isolation. She's been waiting for someone to connect the other end. Ava looked at Wren. She looked at her the way she had looked at Reeves the previous evening, reading the quality of the commitment testing its weight. What she saw in Wren was something different from what she had seen in Reeves. Reeves had been a man absorbing a new reality and deciding to accept it. Wren was a woman who had been living inside a difficult reality for 18 months and had been waiting with controlled patience for the right moment and the right person. You could have filed this yourself, Ava said, any time in the last 18 months. Wren held her gaze. I could have filed a partial finding with insufficient corroboration that Hess would have managed within 30 days, she said. Or I could wait until someone walked into a situation like Fort Liberty and built the evidentiary foundation properly in real time, with witnesses, with a structural review on the record, with junior personnel accounts that are documented and cross-referenced and impossible to quietly reassign away. She paused. I've been doing this for 32 years, Commander. I know the difference between filing and landing. Ava nodded slowly. When does Forsyth arrive? She's already on base, Wren said. She arrived this morning. That landed differently than expected. You planned for this, Ava said. I planned for the possibility, Wren said. When I saw your assessment team assignment for Fort Liberty, I did some reading. Your Fort Calder assessment, the classified section. She looked at Ava directly. You found the same pattern 2 years ago. You documented it in the classified section because you didn't have enough corroboration to include it in the public report. You've been carrying that finding for 2 years. The room was very quiet. Ava looked at the folder on the desk. She thought about the classified section of the Fort Calder report, the pages she had written carefully and precisely, and had been unable to fully use because the evidence, though real, had been insufficient to withstand the kind of institutional pressure that would have been applied to discredit it. She had filed it, she had flagged it, she had received no response, and she had moved on to the next assignment, carrying the incomplete, finding the way you carry something heavy that you can't put down and can't yet deliver. You knew, Ava said. I suspected, Wren said. I confirmed this morning when I read your preliminary summary and saw the log discrepancies. You recognized the pattern immediately because you'd seen it before, at Fort Calder, 2 years ago. Ava sat with this for a moment. The specific quality of the moment was the quality of something that has been waiting a long time to arrive, finally arriving, and the arrival being both a relief and a weight. Forsyth, she said, where is she? Waiting in the secondary conference room, Wren said. I'll take you. They walked together through the corridor, and Wren walked the way she did everything efficiently, without wasted movement, with the specific, directed energy of someone who has been conserving force for the right application and has identified the moment. At the secondary conference room door, she stopped. One more thing, she said. Ava looked at her. Reeves, Wren said, he doesn't know about Hess. He doesn't know about the cross-base pattern. He knows about Fort Liberty. She paused. I need to know before we go further whether you believe he's clean. Ava thought about it. She thought about the briefing room, the thrown folder, the laughter. She thought about the private conference room afterward, the apology that didn't soften itself, the look on his face when he said a man should remember those moments. She thought about the structural review authorization granted, without conditions, without qualifications, without the subtle dilutions that powerful men sometimes attach to concessions when they wanted to appear to yield without fully doing so. He's clean, she said. He's arrogant, and he stopped listening, and his command structure failed because of both of those things. But he's not complicit. Wren nodded. That's consistent with what I know of him. She opened the door. Colonel Dana Forsyth was 53, with close-cropped gray hair, and the kind of physical stillness that tended to develop in people who had spent a long time in situations where visible agitation was a liability. She stood when they entered and extended her hand to Ava without preamble. You're Mitchell, she said. Yes. I read your Fort Calder classified section 2 months ago. Wren got me access. She sat back down and opened a folder of her own. The Pendleton audit shows 9 log discrepancies over a 14-month period. All of them follow the same pattern yours identified. All of them cluster around complex resource-intensive concerns that were filed by junior personnel and would have required supervisory acknowledgement of planning or protocol vulnerabilities to address. She looked up. Hess was present at Pendleton in an advisory capacity for the 6 months preceding and during the period covered by the discrepancies. What was his stated role? Ava asked. Communication Protocol Efficiency Review, Forsyth said. He came in, spent 6 months evaluating the communication chain, filed a report recommending several administrative changes that were implemented and left. She paused. The discrepancies in the log begin approximately 2 months after his arrival and continue through the present. The administrative changes he recommended reduced the number of reporting channels available to junior personnel from 4 to 2, citing efficiency. Ava looked at Wren. Wren said nothing. He's not suppressing reports directly, Ava said slowly. He's restructuring the channels, making the system look more efficient while reducing the pathways that uncomfortable information can travel through. Yes, Forsyth said, and when you reduce the pathways, you don't need to suppress individual reports. The architecture does it for you. The reports go into a narrower channel. The channel is managed by people who have absorbed a particular management philosophy, and the information simply stops reaching the decision-making level. Ava sat down. She looked at both of them. If we document this in the Salcom report with the cross-based pattern requesting an IG investigation, Hess is going to respond immediately. He has people in the review chain. He'll challenge the methodology of the Fort Liberty structural review. He'll attack the individual accounts as uncorroborated. He'll go after Pruitt's credibility issue as a personnel anomaly rather than a systemic pattern. She paused. And he'll go after me, my rank, my history, the Fort Calder classified section that didn't make it into the public report. Yes, Wren said, he will. So the report needs to be airtight before it goes up, Ava said. Every finding cross-referenced, every account corroborated independently, every log discrepancy verified against multiple sources. How long? Forsyth said. The 72-hour deadline doesn't move, Ava said, which means I have approximately 56 hours. She looked at them both. I'm going to need Reeves to authorize an internal communication audit, full access to the base's administrative logging system for the past 12 months. Not just the 72 hours I've reviewed so far. Wren and Forsyth exchanged a look. He'll need to understand why, Wren said. Then tell him why, Ava said. You said he's clean. If he's clean, he'll authorize it. Wren picked up her phone. She called Reeves. The conversation lasted 4 minutes. Ava heard only Wren's side of it, which was mostly silence broken by short, precise statements. When Wren hung up, she said, he's authorizing the audit. He also said, and I'm quoting, tell Mitchell whatever she needs. Ava nodded. She looked at the table. She looked at the 2 women across from her. I need to ask you something, she said, both of you, before we go further. They waited. When this report goes up and the IG investigation opens and Hess starts his response, the institutional pressure is going to be significant. Not just on me, on anyone who corroborated the findings, on anyone whose name is attached to the cross-based pattern documentation. She looked at Forsyth first. You have 14 months of Pendleton audit work that couldn't go anywhere. Attaching it to this report means attaching your name to an investigation that's going to be contested hard by someone with significant institutional relationships. Forsyth looked at her steadily. I've been waiting 14 months to attach my name to exactly this investigation, she said. Ava looked at Wren. Wren said, I called Forsyth 6 weeks ago. I've been building toward this for 18 months. My name was always going to be on it. Ava nodded. She opened her notepad. Then let's build the report, she said. They worked through the afternoon and into the evening with the focused, almost physical intensity of people who understand that the quality of the work in front of them is going to determine outcomes that extend far beyond the room they're sitting in. Forsyth had her Pendleton files. Ava had the Fort Liberty findings in the Fort Calder classified section. Wren had the broader cross-based picture, the pattern documentation she had been accumulating for 18 months, the kind of institutional memory that exists only in the mind of someone who has been paying careful attention for a very long time. At 1400, Holt knocked on the conference room door. Ava stepped out. Pruitt filed a formal response, Holt said. His voice was low. To the structural review findings. He's challenging the characterization of his conversation with Webb as intimidation. He's calling it routine supervisory feedback and saying the review misrepresented its nature. Ava had expected this. Timestamp on the filing, 1247, less than 2 hours after the review closed. Who did he follow it with? The base legal office and a copy to the regional command, Holt said. The regional command copy went to Hess's office. There it was. Pruitt had contacted Hess within 2 hours of the review closing, which meant Hess already knew that Fort Liberty's structural findings were moving, which meant the clock was running faster than she had anticipated. How long before Hess can realistically respond, she said. Holt thought about it. If he moves immediately, he could have a counterfiling to the SOCOM review office within 24 hours. Challenging the methodology, requesting a suspension of the assessment pending review of the structural findings. Can he get a suspension granted in 24 hours? Depends who reviews the request, Holt said. If it routes through standard channels, no. If it routes through someone in his network, possibly. Ava looked at him. I need to know every person in Hess's institutional network who currently holds a position in the SOCOM review chain. Holt blinked. That's not a small request. No, she said. It's not. I need it in 6 hours. He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, I'll need help. Take Chen, she said, and request access through Ren's authorization. She'll clear it. He left at a near run. She went back inside. Ren had been watching the door. Pruitt, filed within 2 hours. Copy to Hess. Forsyth said, he's faster than I expected. He's scared, Ava said. Scared people move fast. She sat back down. We need to accelerate the cross-base pattern section. If Hess files a challenge before our report goes up, we need the pattern documentation already in the SOCOM system, so the challenge reads as responsive rather than preemptive. You want to move the filing deadline, Ren said. I want to file the preliminary pattern findings tonight, Ava said. Not the full report, just the cross-base pattern documentation as an interim supplement to the Fort Liberty assessment. It establishes the record before Hess's challenge can frame the narrative. Ren and Forsyth looked at each other. That's aggressive, Forsyth said. Yes, Ava said. It is. If the preliminary filing is thin and Hess's challenge comes in strong, it makes the full report look reactive, Ren said. The preliminary filing won't be thin, Ava said. I have Fort Liberty. I have Fort Calder. You have 18 months of cross-base observation. Forsyth has Pendleton. 3 independent, documented instances of the same structural pattern connected by the presence of the same individual in an advisory capacity at or before the onset of each pattern. She paused. That's not thin. That's a finding. Ren was quiet for a moment. Then she said, draft it. At 1730, Holt came back with the network mapping. He spread it across the table, a hand-drawn diagram connecting names and positions through the SOCOM review chain. It was the kind of document that shouldn't exist in written form and that both of them understood would need to be destroyed after use. Ava studied it. There were 3 names in the SOCOM review chain with documented connections to Hess. 2 of them were distant, the kind of institutional relationships that existed by proximity rather than alignment. One of them was not. A Colonel Marcus Thayer, currently serving as Deputy Director of the SOCOM Assessment Review Office, had served under Hess at an advisory capacity 3 years prior and had been recommended for his current position by a board on which Hess had served. Thayer reviews incoming assessment supplements, Holt said. He said it quietly as if the words themselves were dangerous. So if Hess files a challenge and it routes to Thayer, Forsyth began, it gets processed sympathetically, Ren finished, and our preliminary filing gets flagged for additional review instead of being entered into the record. Ava looked at the diagram. She looked at it for a long time. Is there a direct channel to the IG's office that bypasses the assessment review office entirely? She said. Ren said yes, but using it directly without going through SOCOM review first requires flag officer authorization. You're a 2-star, Ava said. Ren held her gaze. Yes, she said. I am. The room was very quiet. Maureen picked up her pen. She looked at the draft preliminary filing in front of her. She looked at the network diagram. She looked at the 4 bases represented in the folder. 4 separate communities of soldiers, junior personnel specialists, sergeants, the Webbs and the Ferrises, and the Torreses, people who had done their jobs correctly and been systematically prevented from having that work matter. She signed the authorization. At 1900, the preliminary cross-base pattern filing went directly to the Inspector General's office, bypassing the SOCOM Assessment Review Office entirely. At 1947, Ava's secure terminal showed a receipt confirmation from the IG's office. At 20:12 minutes, her phone showed an incoming call from a number she didn't recognize. She looked at it for a moment. She answered. Commander Mitchell. The voice was measured, well-modulated, the voice of a person who had spent considerable time learning how to sound exactly as reasonable as they needed to sound. This is Colonel Raymond Hess. The room went absolutely still. Wren and Forsyth both looked up. Ava kept her voice completely level. Colonel Hess, I understand you've been conducting a structural assessment at Fort Liberty, he said. Yes, sir. And that you filed a preliminary supplement with the IG's office this evening. Yes, sir. There was a pause. The pause was calibrated. She could hear him choosing his next words with the specific care of someone who understood that this conversation might be reviewed later. I want you to know, he said, that I'm fully supportive of thorough assessment processes. I think what you're doing at Fort Liberty serves an important function. I'm glad to hear that, sir. I do want to flag as a matter of professional courtesy that some of the findings as they've been described to me appear to reflect a mischaracterization of certain communication practices that I've been involved in developing at multiple bases. I'd welcome the opportunity to provide context before any formal findings are finalized. The formal findings will go through the appropriate investigative process, Ava said. You'll have full opportunity to provide context through that process. Another pause, longer this time. Commander Mitchell, he said, and his voice had shifted very slightly, barely perceptibly, but she heard it. You're a careful officer. I respect that. I want to make sure you understand the full institutional context of what you're looking at before you commit to a finding that may have implications you haven't fully considered. I appreciate the concern, sir, she said. I'm confident in the methodology. There was a moment of silence. Of course, he said. I look forward to the process. He hung up. Ava set the phone down. Wren was watching her. How did he sound? Controlled, Ava said. Careful. He was warning me without saying anything that could be characterized as a warning. Did it work? Forsyth said. Ava looked at them both. No, she said. She picked up her pen. At 2200, she sent the full structured draft of Part 4 of the assessment to Wren and Forsyth for review. At 2330, with their corrections incorporated, she finalized the cross-base pattern section and attached it to the IG preliminary filing as a supplemental document. At midnight, she sat back in her chair in the assessment workspace and looked at the ceiling for 30 seconds. Holt was still at the desk across from her, the network diagram now in pieces in the burn bag. He had been quiet for the last 2 hours working through the corroboration cross-reference with the methodical patience that was his specific form of loyalty. It's in the system, he said. Yes, she said. What happens now? She thought about it. The IG opens a preliminary inquiry within 72 hours. They'll contact Forsyth and Wren independently to corroborate the cross-base findings. They'll pull the Fort Calder files officially. They'll request the full administrative logging access for Pendleton and the other 2 bases. She paused. And they'll contact Hess. And Hess will respond. Immediately, she said, with everything he has. Holt was quiet for a moment. Then, you knew when you walked into that briefing room yesterday morning that it might come to this. She looked at him. I knew there was something wrong with the information environment at Fort Liberty, she said. I didn't know yet that it connected to anything larger. That part I found after Reeves threw me out. So he did you a favor, Holt said. It wasn't quite a joke. It was the specific dry observation of someone who had worked alongside Ava long enough to understand how her particular kind of work operated. In a way, she said, she thought about the briefing room, the folder thrown across the table, the papers in the air, the laughter, the 37 seconds of absolute humiliation in front of 43 officers and 5,000 watching soldiers. She thought about what she had seen in those 37 seconds that she would not have seen from a chair at that briefing table. The specific geography of a room full of people who had been taught by years of operating inside a particular system that the most important thing in any situation was to read where the authority was and align with it. Not the truth, not the information. The authority, she had seen that standing at the door in the moment before she turned and walked out. She had carried it with her through the monitoring station, through 14 interviews, through the structural review, through the cross-based pattern analysis, through Hess's phone call. Get some sleep, she said to Holt. Tomorrow is going to be complicated. He stood stretching. More complicated than today. Significantly, she said. He picked up his jacket. At the door, he stopped. Ava, he said. She looked up. For what it's worth, he said, I've worked with a lot of assessment officers. The ones who find what you found today are rare. The ones who know what to do with it are rarer. He paused. The ones who are still standing at the end are rarest of all. He left. She sat alone in the assessment workspace with the hum of the secure terminals and the night sounds of Fort Liberty outside, and she thought about all the things that were already in motion and all the things that hadn't yet begun, and she felt, not for the first time in her career, the particular weight of a position where the next thing she did was going to matter enormously, and the full scale of how much it mattered was not entirely visible yet. She picked up her phone. One unread message, received 40 minutes ago while she was finalizing the supplement. It was from Reeves. It said, I pulled the live broadcast footage from yesterday morning. The moment you walked out, I watched it 3 times. I want you to know that when this is over, however it ends, the record will show what you did and how you did it. J. Reeves. She read it twice. Then she set the phone down, opened a new page in her notepad, and wrote the first line of the full formal report. The full formal report went into the SOCOM system at 0417 in the morning. Ava had been awake for 22 hours. She didn't feel it yet. That was the specific mercy of work that mattered. The body agreed to suspend its complaints until the thing was done. She had learned this years ago in a different kind of field, under different kinds of pressure, and she had never stopped being grateful for it. She sat in the assessment workspace with the confirmation receipt on her screen and the specific silence of a base at 4 in the morning, around her that particular quality of institutional quiet where the building itself seems to be holding its breath, and she allowed herself exactly 90 seconds of stillness before she opened her notepad and began writing the list of what came next. At 0500, her phone rang. It was Forsyth. The IG acknowledged receipt, Forsyth said. Her voice had the alert, focused quality of someone who had also not slept. They're opening a preliminary inquiry. Official notification goes to Hess within the hour. Within the hour, Ava repeated. Yes, standard protocol. The subject of a preliminary inquiry receives notification simultaneously with the inquiry opening. So Hess knows within the hour. Yes, Ava looked at the wall. He'll move immediately. He'll have no choice, Forsyth said. The preliminary filing is already in the system. He can't manage the narrative before it's established. He can only respond to it. Responding to it is what he's good at, Ava said. Yes, Forsyth said, but responding to 3 independent documented instances with corroborating witnesses and cross-reference log discrepancies is different from responding to a single assessment, finding that never had enough corroboration to stand on its own. She paused. You gave it what it needed. 2 years after Fort called her, you gave it what it needed. Ava said nothing for a moment. Get some sleep, Dana, she said. We're going to need to be sharp when this opens up. She hung up. At 0545, she was at the commissary getting coffee when Sergeant Ferris walked in. He was in his PT gear, early morning run finished, and he stopped when he saw her with the specific expression of someone who registers an unexpected presence and doesn't know yet how to organize their reaction. Commander Mitchell, he said. Ferris. She poured a second cup and handed it to him before he could decide whether to get his own. It was a small gesture, and she didn't call attention to it. He took it. He looked at her over the rim. Did you sleep? Some, she said, which was technically true if you counted the 40 minutes she had spent with her eyes closed on the assessment workspace couch at approximately 0200. He wrapped both hands around the cup. He had the particular quietness of a man who has things to say and is deciding whether the moment is the right one. She recognized it. She waited. My team leader called me last night, he said. After the review, he apologized. She looked at him. For what specifically? For telling me the terrain concern was being handled, Ferris said. He said he should have followed up himself instead of assuming someone above him was doing it. He said he knew at the time that it was a real concern and he didn't push hard enough. He paused. He's a good team leader. He's been in this unit for 6 years. He was upset. What did you tell him? Ferris thought about it. I told him I understood, that the system made it easy to pass things up and assume they were landing. He paused again. And I told him I was going to keep filing, no matter what, that I was done assuming the system would handle it on its own. Ava looked at him for a moment. Good, she said simply. He nodded. He started to turn away, then stopped. Is it true that the review findings are going somewhere bigger than Fort Liberty? She held his gaze. Yes, she said. It's true. He absorbed this. Because of what I filed. Because of what you filed, she said, and what Torres filed, and what Webb filed, and what Park filed 8 months ago, and what Mendez wrote in his personal log that nobody asked for. She paused. Every one of those people did something that the system told them wasn't worth doing. They did it anyway. That's why it's going somewhere bigger. Ferris looked at his coffee, then he looked at her. My father was in the Army, he said, 20 years. He used to tell me that the most dangerous thing in the military wasn't the enemy. It was the silence inside the wire. He paused. I didn't fully understand what he meant until this week. Ava looked at him for a long moment. Your father was right, she said. She took her coffee and walked back toward the administrative building. The base was waking up around her, the specific layered sounds of a large organization moving from night mode into morning operations. The shift change voices, the vehicle engines, the distant organized motion of thousands of people beginning another day. Inside a system that was as of approximately 0417 this morning, in the process of changing. At 0730, she was back in the assessment workspace when the first counterfiling arrived. It came through the SOCOM review office routed by Colonel Marcus Thayer. And it was exactly what she had anticipated, a formal challenge to the methodology of the Fort Liberty Structural Review, questioning the validity of individual accounts taken without standard interview protocols, challenging the characterization of log discrepancies as systemic rather than administrative, and requesting a suspension of the assessment findings pending independent review. It was well written, precise, the language of someone who understood assessment processes deeply and knew exactly which procedural levers to apply pressure to. Holt read it over her shoulder. He's fast, Holt said. He had it drafted before he called me last night, Ava said. The call was reconnaissance. He was checking what I knew and how certain I was. The filing was already written. Can Thayer grant the suspension? Not unilaterally, she said. He needs concurrence from the deputy SOCOM commander. That's a 2-star decision. How long? Standard timeline is 48 hours, she said. If Thayer pushes it as urgent, 24. Holt looked at her. And if the suspension gets granted before the IG inquiry gets traction, the preliminary filing stays in the system regardless of a SOCOM suspension, she said. The IG operates independently of SOCOM review. That's why Wren filed it through the direct channel last night. She paused. Hess knows that, which means the counterfiling isn't about stopping the inquiry. It's about creating a parallel narrative. He wants a record that shows the Fort Liberty findings were disputed at the methodology level before the IG inquiry was opened. It makes the inquiry look politically motivated rather than evidentiary. Can he make that argument stick? Depends on the inquiry team, she said, and on what they find when they pull the Fort Calder and Pendleton files officially. Her phone buzzed, a message from Wren, my office. Bring the counterfiling. She printed it and walked. Wren had a Forsyth with her and a third person. Ava hadn't met a compact man in his late 40s with the specific bearing of someone who operated at a level where bearing was a form of communication. Wren introduced him as Brigadier General Paul Carver, IG, Liaison Officer, Joint Chiefs Advisory Staff. Ava shook his hand. Sit down, Commander, Carver said. She sat. He had the counterfiling in his hand already, which meant Wren had sent it to him before Ava arrived. I've been reading your preliminary filing, he said. In the Fort Calder classified section, in Forsyth's Pendleton audit, he set the counterfiling on the table. This is Thayer. Yes, sir. Thayer has been in the SOCOM review office for 3 years. He's considered reliable. He looked at her steadily. I've had questions about his objectivity on certain matters for approximately 8 months. The room shifted slightly. Hess's network, Ava said. Yes. Carver looked at Wren. The fact that Thayer routed this counterfiling within 2 hours of the IG notification going to Hess is going to be noted in the inquiry record. He looked back at Ava. I'm not here as a friend of your findings, Commander. I'm here because the IG directed me to make a preliminary assessment of whether the inquiry should be elevated to a formal investigation immediately rather than proceeding through the standard preliminary phase. Ava held his gaze. And I need to ask you one question, he said. The cross-base pattern documentation, the log discrepancies across 4 bases, the presence of the same individual in an advisory capacity at or before the onset of each pattern. He paused. In your professional judgment as an assessment officer with 6 years of this specific kind of work, is this a systemic operation? Or is it a series of independent institutional failures that happen to share common features? The room was very quiet. Ava thought about Ferris and his terrain report filed twice. She thought about Webb deciding not to file a second concern because the first one had cost her a threat. She thought about Park's proposal 8 months in a queue. She thought about Hess's phone call the previous night, measured and reasonable and precise, in the exact way that a prepared response is precise. She thought about Thayer's counterfiling drafted and ready before the IG notification had been in the system for 2 hours. It's a systemic operation, she said, in my professional judgment. With the evidence currently documented. Carver nodded once. He picked up his phone and made a call that lasted 45 seconds. When he hung up, he looked at Wren. The inquiry is elevated, he said. Formal investigation effective immediately. Hess is placed on administrative hold pending the investigation. Thayer is recused from all matters related to the Fort Liberty assessment and any connected filings. He looked at Ava. Your report stands. The counterfiling is suspended pending the investigation outcome. Forsyth let out a breath. Wren said nothing. She looked at the table, and in the quality of her silence was 18 months of careful, patient, difficult work, arriving at the moment it had been built toward. Ava said the 6 junior personnel whose accounts form the foundation of the structural review. Ferris, Torres, Webb, Park, Mendez, Rodriguez. I want formal protection orders in their service records before this investigation becomes public. If Hess's response targets the individual witnesses, already requested, Carver said, the IG issued them simultaneously with the elevation order. She stopped. She hadn't expected that. The IG read your preliminary filing very carefully, Carver said. The section on witness protection protocols was noted specifically. Ava looked at him. I didn't write a witness protection section in the preliminary filing. Carver looked at her steadily. No, he said. Wren did. She added it when she signed the authorization last night. Ava turned and looked at Wren. Wren met her eyes without expression. But underneath the controlled stillness, something was there. The particular satisfaction of a person who has been waiting a very long time to do something that needed doing and has finally done it. Thank you, Ava said. Wren nodded once. The meeting ended. Carver left first, moving with the compressed efficiency of a man with considerable things to do in a short time. Forsyth lingered at the door. Fort Calder, she said to Ava, the classified section. The finding you couldn't fully document 2 years ago. Yes. It's in the record now, Forsyth said. Officially. The investigation will pull it. Whatever you couldn't do with it, then the investigation can do with it now. Ava looked at her. 2 years was a long time to carry something that needed to be delivered and couldn't be. She had not let herself think about that weight directly, because thinking about it directly while she was still inside the system that had produced it was not productive. She had filed it, flagged it, and kept working. Yes, she said simply, it is. Forsyth left. Ava stood in Wren's office alone for a moment. Wren had gone to make calls, leaving with the brisk movement of someone whose to-do list had just expanded significantly. The room was quiet, the maps on the walls were current, the desk was cleared. She thought about what came next, and it was large and complicated and not yet fully visible. The way the consequences of a correctly filed report are always larger and more complicated than the report itself, rippling outward through the system in ways that would take months and possibly years to fully resolve. She thought about Hess in whatever room he was in right now, receiving the notification that the inquiry had been elevated to a formal investigation and that he was on administrative hold. She tried to imagine his face and couldn't quite. She didn't know his face well enough. She had met him once briefly 14 months ago, and he had seemed competent and well-organized, and she had not thought about him again until 40 hours ago. She thought about all the things that had needed to be exactly right for this moment to happen. The timing of her assessment team assignment to Fort Liberty, the live broadcast that put 5,000 soldiers in front of what Reeves did in that briefing room, the 40 minutes she had spent studying maps that everyone else ignored, the 12-minute prediction, the structural review, Wren's 18 months of careful patient documentation, Forsyth's 14 months of Pendleton audit work, Carver's 8 months of questions about Thayer. The whole long, complicated architecture of a moment that looked from the outside like one woman walking into a room and predicting a military exercise failure. At 10:00, she walked back to the main command center. Reeves was there. He was at a desk for the first time since the exercise, not at the command display, but at the actual desk, which meant he was doing administrative work rather than operational work, and the distinction said something about where his head was. He looked up when she entered. "Mitchell," he said. "Sir." He looked at her for a moment. He had the expression of a man who had received significant information in the last several hours and was still organizing his response to it. "The formal investigation," he said. "Yes, sir." "Hess," he said. And then after a pause, "I've worked with Hess. I've attended the same conferences. I've implemented protocol recommendations that came through his advisory office." He paused again. "I didn't see it." "He's very good," she said. "The architecture is designed to be invisible from above. That's the specific skill of it." Reeves looked at his hands, then he looked at her. "The 6 remedies from yesterday's structural review, I want them implemented at Fort Liberty, regardless of the investigation timeline. Whatever the investigation finds, this base needs those changes." "Yes, sir." "I'm assigning Garrett to oversee the implementation," he said. "I want a progress report every 2 weeks. And I want the junior personnel who participated in the structural review assigned to the implementation advisory team. Their names on the official record as contributors." Ava looked at him. He said it without fanfare, without the performance of generosity. He said it the way a person says something they have decided and mean. "That's the right call, sir," she said. He nodded. Then he did something she hadn't expected. He stood up from his desk, which was the standing up of a man who wants to have a conversation as 2 people, rather than as a superior and a subordinate. And he said, "What you did in this room 2 days ago, walking in with no rank display, no commendations, no performance of authority, just the information." She waited. "I've been in the Navy for 41 years, he said. "I have never in 41 years been in a situation where the person who was right was also the person I dismissed before they finished their first sentence." He paused. "I want to make sure I understand what I'm taking away from that." "What are you taking away from it, sir?" she said, not rhetorical, genuinely asking. I thought about it. He thought about it the way a serious person thinks about a serious question, not quickly and not with the performance of deliberation, but with actual consideration. "That rank is a tool," he said, "not a filter. I've been using it as a filter for long enough that I stopped noticing I was doing it." He paused. "When you walked into my briefing room, I processed you through the filter before I heard a single word you said. I decided what you were before you opened your mouth, and then I spent the next 12 minutes proving myself right about something I'd already decided." He looked at her steadily. "That's not leadership. That's bureaucracy in a uniform." Ava held his gaze. "Yes, sir," she said. "It is." The acknowledgement cost him something. She could see it, not the saying of it, but the full weight of what it meant applied to 4 decades of command decisions, the ones that had gone right and the ones that had gone wrong, and the new and uncomfortable question of how many of the wrong ones had looked like the briefing room. "You're going to be at SOCOM in 3 years, he said. It wasn't a prediction. It was a statement of fact delivered by someone who understood the institutional landscape well enough to see where things were going. "I don't plan that far ahead," she said. He almost smiled. "No," he said. "I imagine you don't." At 1100, she called her brother. Thomas Mitchell answered on the second ring with the particular alertness of someone who has been waiting for a call without knowing exactly when it would come. They had a relationship built on infrequent contact and the specific efficiency of siblings who understood each other without requiring a lot of explanation. "You okay?" he said. "Yes," she said. "I'm okay." "I saw the broadcast," he said, "the briefing room yesterday morning." She hadn't known it had gone public. She waited. It's been running on the military news feeds, he said. The clip. You walking out. What you said. He paused. Ava. Thomas? You good? I'm good, she said. It's a long story. I'll tell you when it's fully resolved. How long? Months probably, and she said, the investigation is formal now. It's going to take time. He was quiet for a moment. You know what Dad used to say, he said. Their father had been a quiet man who said few things and meant all of them. She knew exactly what he used to say. He used to say, the truth is patient, she said. It can wait as long as it needs to. Yeah, Thomas said. Yeah, he did. She hung up. At 1400, the base commander's office released an internal communication to all Fort Liberty personnel. It was signed by Admiral Reeves, and it was by military communication standards extraordinary. It did not describe the investigation or mention Hess by name. What it did was describe the structural review, acknowledge the 6 junior personnel by name and rank, thank them formally for their contributions, and announce the implementation of the 6 structural remedies effective immediately. It described the remedies in plain language that any soldier on the base could understand what had failed, what was changing, and why. The last paragraph read, leadership is not the absence of error. Leadership is the willingness to find the error, team it honestly, and rebuild. This base will be better because 7 people did their jobs correctly when the system made it difficult to do so. Remember their names: Ferris, Torres, Webb, Park, Mendez, Rodriguez, and Mitchell. By 1500, the communication had been read by virtually every person on the base. By 1530, Sergeant Ferris had received 14 separate messages from soldiers across Fort Liberty. He had never spoken to, telling him they had filed concerns today that they had been sitting on for weeks. He forwarded every one of them to the new anonymous reporting channel that went live that morning. At 1700, Ava sat in the assessment workspace for what she understood was probably the last time. Her team was packing. The formal assessment was complete. The investigation was opened and properly staffed. Her presence at Fort Liberty had served its purpose, and her next assignment was already waiting: another base, another evaluation, another room full of people who had stopped listening to the people below them. Holt came and sat across from her. Forsyth's heading back to Pendleton tomorrow, he said. She said to tell you it was an honor. Ava nodded. Tell her the same. He looked at her. You're not going to take a day. After the next one, she said. He shook his head. You always say that. And it's always true, she said. He picked up his bag. At the door he stopped. He did this consistently. Holt to stop at the door, the last thing said being the thing that actually mattered. She had learned to wait for it. The investigation is going to be hard, he said. Hess has resources. He's going to come at the methodology, the witnesses, your history, everything he can reach. It's going to be months of that before it resolves. I know, she said. And when it does resolve, it's going to resolve correctly, he said, because you built it correctly. Every account corroborated, every log discrepancy verified, every connection documented independently. He paused. I've been doing this work for 12 years, Ava. I've seen findings that deserved to land and didn't because the build wasn't solid enough. Yours is solid. She looked at him. Derek Holt, 12 years, the specific, quiet loyalty of a person who showed up for the right reasons and stayed for the same reasons. Thank you, she said, for all of it. He nodded. He left. She sat alone. At 1800, Specialist Torres knocked on the door of the assessment workspace. She waved him in. He entered with the careful posture of someone who has learned in the last 48 hours that the spaces he walks into might be more consequential than he previously understood. I heard the base communication, he said. Yes. My name was in it. Yes, she said. It was. He stood there for a moment. 23 years old with a fixed radio and a correct instinct, and 2 days of waiting in an annex that had just become in the official record of Fort Liberty. An act of documented competence that a 4-star Admiral had thanked him for by name in a base-wide communication. I don't know what to do with that, he said honestly. She looked at him. You don't have to do anything with it, she said. Just keep doing what you did. See the problem. Fix it. Tell someone. Don't wait for permission to use the solution you built. He nodded slowly. He started to leave, then turned back. That moment, he said, when you walked out of the briefing room, in the broadcast. When you said the western flank was going to collapse, he paused. I was watching the broadcast with my unit. When you said it, everyone laughed, because the Admiral had just thrown you out. He paused again. And I didn't laugh. I don't know why. Something about the way you said it, like you weren't trying to convince anyone, like you were just saying the thing that was true, and the truth of it didn't need anyone's permission to be true. Ava looked at him for a long moment. That's exactly right, she said. That's exactly what it was. He left. Shazams. She sat with the quiet. Outside Fort Liberty continued its evening. 5,000 soldiers moving through the specific rhythms of a large operational base at the end of a day that would be discussed for years, the day the exercise failed, and the day that followed it, the structural review, the 6 names in the base-wide communication, the formal investigation that was now moving through the system with the slow, irreversible momentum of properly documented truth. She thought about the hook of it all, a folder thrown across a table, a fist on a map, 37 seconds of public humiliation in front of 43 officers and 5,000 watching soldiers. She thought about what had happened in the 40 hours after those 37 seconds. She thought about Webb, who was going to stay in drone ops. She thought about Ferris forwarding 14 concern filings to the new anonymous channel. She thought about Torres, who had seen the truth in her voice before the truth had proven itself. She thought about Reeves, who had spent 41 years building a particular relationship with his own authority and had started revising it in a private conference room the same evening it failed him. She thought about Ren 18 months building toward a moment that required exactly the right person to walk into exactly the right situation and do the work correctly. And she thought about all the other bases, all the other communication chains, with their invisible compressions, their silent suppressions, their architectural reduction of the pathways through which uncomfortable truth could travel. All the other Ferrises and Webbs and Torreses doing their jobs correctly inside systems that had been quietly redesigned to make their correctness unreachable. The investigation would reach some of them. The remedies, if properly implemented and properly watched, would reach more. And she would keep doing this work, moving from base to base, sitting in briefing rooms, where powerful men had decided before she finished her first sentence what she was worth finding, the places where information had stopped traveling, pulling the truth up from the places where the system had let it settle. She was not famous. She was not decorated. She did not appear in histories that people read or stories that people told at ceremony dinners. She operated in the precise space between what the system claimed about itself and what the system actually was, and she had been doing it for 6 years, and she was going to keep doing it. Because the most dangerous condition in any organization was not incompetence. It was not insufficient resources or inadequate training or outdated equipment. It was the silence inside the wire. The silence that happened when the people closest to the truth stopped believing their truth was worth the cost of saying it out loud. Every time she walked into a room and asked the questions that nobody else was asking, every time she found the report that had stopped traveling and traced it back to where it began, every time she sat across from a specialist or a sergeant or a corporal and said, "Your instinct was correct. The system failed you, not the other way around," she was doing the same thing. She was making the silence speakable. At 1900, she picked up her bag, turned off the lights in the assessment workspace, and walked out of the building into the Fort Liberty evening. Her phone showed a new assignment notification. Different base, different command structure, different room full of maps and officers and information that had stopped reaching the people who needed it. She accepted the assignment. She put the phone in her pocket. And she walked forward because the work was never finished and the truth was patient, and as long as the silence existed, so did she.